Next up, inspiring governments to maintain the edge. What the edge? Well, how to bring together the never the twain shall meet, public and private. Can ever work together? How a bit of development in a couple of key specific areas can have a huge impact on the economy proper and, of course, the cognitive economy as well. One of the best to bring it to you as well. His partner at venture capital firm Quartz Capital, investing into global emerging category leaders. He's responsible for the fundraising side of that, generating new deal flow sources, but also for coming up with a general vision, the general outlook of the fund. Flown in especially to bring his presentation to us, inspiring governments to maintain the edge. How do we keep that edge? Please welcome Maxim Matthias.
Thanks a lot for having me, Dubai. I would like to ask you a question. First picture. Second picture incoming, and third picture. So what do you see in these three pictures? In the first picture, we are witnessing the first piece of technology ever being created. In the second picture, we see the first voyage, Christopher Columbus's ship setting sail from Europe through the Atlantic towards the horizon to only come back with one of the greatest discoveries ever made. In the third picture, we see the Apollo 11 mission. A small step indeed, but resulting in a giant leap for mankind, progressing the world further. You can ask yourself multiple questions here. Were they all running from something? Was fear their biggest motivator? Or did they simply get curious because it is part of their DNA? When I look at paintings and pictures like this, I always tend to see three things. Firstly, the human side of things, where I imagine the traits and characteristics of those adventurers and the imagination and the power that they got that made them want to break a frontier. Secondly, imagine the investment side of things. Imagine what Christopher Columbus's sales pitch must have been to the local government and the private contractors who were brave and crazy enough to believe that story. And thirdly, from a governance perspective, imagine gluing all these tiny puzzle pieces together, like in the Apollo 11 mission, turning it into reality. So, I got curious on a random day. I visited the World Bank's website and stumbled upon their research and development feature, because what else is there to do, right? To make you understand it, it shows you a country's annual GDP and a tiny proportion of it that is being invested into R&D, meaning new technologies, education, attracting talent, and so on. So I asked myself a very basic question. How do we, basically, if I study a certain nation, say Germany, UK, or UAE, and I would look at the country and the similar way I do when studying a startup at the verge of becoming a unicorn, would I ultimately invest into it or not? As a venture capitalist, you stitch together tons of different data sources. You progress kind of like your feeling for emerging market, about disruptive forces, and you basically every single day progress your inner gut feeling to see how far we can go. Here we see a leaderboard that I have generated for a few countries. Sorry, there is a delay. Yeah, so here we see a leaderboard that I have generated for a few countries, and it shows their respective R&D in terms of percentage and the dollars spent. Over the last year, in the United States, the GDP was close to 3.5%. That's resulting in $720 billion. That's 1% larger than China, and even if it sounds like a tiny number, the resultant economic output is enormous. South Korea, together with Israel, are actually the highest R&D investors in the world, and you can clearly feel and see this. In South Korea, 75% of all the R&D originates from the private sector, primarily from companies like Samsung, so not the government. The average for most developed nations is approximately 70%. The UK is slightly below that, and that's very alarming. In South Korea, for many aspiring professionals, the term Samsung man exists, and they have a choice to make. Either go work for the private sector, primarily companies like Samsung or startups, or choose the public sector. And rather rarely does the public sector win. Germany, one of the pillars of the EU, has amongst the highest R&D spending in terms of dollars and percentages in the world. But what matters is not where these R&D dollars are being invested into, but directly kind of like where it results into. Now, I'd like you to imagine that you are a German citizen. So what comes to mind? Well, perhaps it is the Made in Germany brand, cars, and everything else exporting to the entire world. In tech, some of this we call legacy systems. Now, imagine you're sitting on a legacy throne in the 80s and 90s, and all of the new tech and opportunities are flying by you. Fast forward, you and I are in 2023. So how would you feel if these new opportunities, new tech, everything is flying by you? This is a common discussion behind closed doors in the European Union and needs to be discussed if we as governments want to create and maintain our edge. And unfortunately, most of Germany's R&D budget goes into maintaining these legacy systems. That's absolutely fine and very much needed, but I'm sure that all of you as German citizens want progress. So how do we increase our actual R&D budget, upskill our workforce, and boost our economy? What's fascinating is that each public dollar in Japan long-term translates into more than $3 coming from the private sector. That's just how it works. But the government also expects a return one way or another. Can you believe that if that's not economic fuel, then what is? Here we see what R&D looks like under the magnifying glass. The 100% that we see on the screen, that's the entire global R&D budget. And our shocking insight here is that hype around a certain topic, for example, climate change, doesn't necessarily mean that it's receiving the majority of the budget. Let me show you. This is how much goes into hardware and electronics, 23.5%. Pharmaceuticals and biotech, cars, and software, leaving us with less than 1/3 for all the other stuff. But what's truly interesting is how much goes into alternative energy. To be precise, only 1% does. Only 1. We have been labeling alternative energy now for decades, but what we can clearly see from this slide is that we don't care about it at all. I'm not trying to be like Greta here, but if we care for our future, that something in that number needs to change, right? There's also a good thing to all of this. Out of all of the startup founders that I see, approximately 1 in 10 is trying to create an impact. And we need governments to grab onto this and just make it simply bigger and more powerful. Do you remember that 70% of all the R&D budget comes from the private sector? So where exactly is it coming from? On this slide, we see the top corporate R&D spenders, you know, the more notable names, Samsung, Volkswagen, Huawei, etc. This batch of companies have amongst the highest R&D budgets in the world, but their growth is somewhat steady. This batch of companies, on the left side, General Electric, Nestle, HSBC, they have shrinking R&D budgets. keep this in mind when studying the company deeper. But what about companies that are breaking the frontier in a literal sense? For example, SpaceX. When studying the company closer, we will clearly see that it is attracting some of the biggest talents in the world, because everybody wants to write history. And that, for one, is the key to maintaining an edge, attracting talent. Sorry, something we don't see here, not on this slide, something we don't see here is how big of a contributor venture capital is to all of this. Approximately 1% of US GDP comes from venture capital. And if we're looking at all of the top corporates and public companies, more than 50% of VC-backed companies like Amazon, Apple, and so on are actually the contributors in this. On the right side of this graph, we also see Amazon, the orange blurb. It's massive, isn't it? It's one of those whales that is kind of cruising through oceans, not behind Christopher Columbus, but is generating more R&D than entire nations. If we compare Amazon basically to the United Kingdom, it spends almost as much as the entire United Kingdom taken together. So I have a question for you. Are governments able to keep up with a pace like that we see from the private sector? If there only would be a map basically outlining where the R&D investment of companies are going into. Luckily, we have a map made by CB Insights that shows exactly the strategy of Amazon. Amazon has 3 strategies. It invests, acquires, and partners up with companies. And all of those have a common pattern. Some of those startups and corporates are all trying to leverage data. And some of those tech-native whales that we saw on the previous slide, they all have this in common. They're basically thinking of you as users and the data that you are generating, and it is part of their central recipe for the firm's future success. Are governments doing the same, or is it just in the private sector? So what we as governments need to do is we need to take an active change and basically look at companies like that and perhaps even learn from them. So how can governments create an edge, and even better, how do they maintain it, similar to the discussions that we would have in the European Union? The evolution of our recent economy is able to assist us here. In the past, we had an industrial revolution, meaning a classic traditional buyer and supplier relationship, where our focus was primarily on mass and product-centric creation. Through digitalization and the sudden urge of interconnecting absolutely everything, we're now moving towards a platform economy that is powered by data. And new services are being created literally from thin air here. There is, of course, curiosity that is being created by entrepreneurs, and there is a need. But here you see that the investment side of things and the human talent is working beautifully together. But what will the post-platform economy look like? I don't mean in 100 years, but in 10, 20. Perhaps the platform middleman will also be removed. And then our focus will be on absolute resource and cost optimization, solving highly complex social, labor, and economic aspects. Where does that leave the governments? Some of the players that we see currently in the platform economy are already reaping the benefits. And some of those will become category leaders in the cognitive economy. So what's highly important in order to answer that question is that governments are currently in a limbo. They need to be able to understand that the private sector is creating certain trends out there. They're not always able to follow it. Only some of them are now slowly waking up out of a dream in the industrial economy, and are basically digitalizing some of their governmental services. So they have a unique opportunity today. They're able to follow these trends, but even more than that, they will be able to create those trends and be like those adventurers, Christopher Columbus and whoever was working in the Apollo 11 mission, and use those innovative tools that the private sector gives them and the public sector as well, and create and build out those trends, and even more, use that in order to build out a modern legacy. The most important part is that when the future humans will be looking at the times of digitalization, they will have to say that there was a collaboration between the private and the public sector. And we don't want that they don't say, fools, why didn't you start to collaborate earlier, learn from each other, be curious about each other, and create a powerful edge that you're able to maintain. So I will leave you with your own curiosity to think about it, how you can build this bridge between the private and the public sector. Thank you very much.